Hey friends, one of my favorite books of the Bible is the book of Nehemiah. I love it because it's chock full of wisdom and insight, especially in the area of leadership and leading personal and organizational change. So much insight can be gleaned from Nehemiah's example of stepping out of one's comfort zone into the middle of a crisis and with God's help initiating change and transformation. It doesn't matter whether we're ministers or educators, supervisors or employees, parents or children, a retired person or working, whoever we are, wherever God has placed us, requires us to learn how to step out of our own comfort zone and to step into a broken area to help fortify, rebuild, or strengthen persons, processes, or procedures. This was Nehemiah, a high-ranking government worker, as cupbearer to the king of Persia in the ancient world. But the Lord burdened his heart for his people back in Jerusalem, thousands of miles away. And what is interesting, Nehemiah began to ask questions. This seems to be more important than knowing the answers. He didn't know the full extent of the crisis situation. He didn't know how exactly he could help build and Ezra the scribe's work there. But he did know he had to do something. He knew the Lord and he knew the scripture. Listen as Nehemiah chapter 1, verses 1 through 4, these opening verses. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah, in the month of Kislev in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. Verse 3. They said to me, those who survived the exile are back in the province and are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. Listen to Nehemiah's response. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. And so here's Nehemiah as he takes this posture of curiosity and humility. And he asks his brothers questions about the state of Jerusalem. Guys, what's going on? How's everything going? And then he hears the news that devastates him. And Nehemiah weeps and he fasts and he prays before the God of heaven. What is remarkable about Nehemiah's prayer, especially in verses 5 through 11, we won't read it now, but when you look through that prayer, it's just full of scripture. It's saturated with his understanding of God's covenantal love for him and his people back in Jerusalem. Andrew Murray says this, he says, true conversion is nothing less than to surrender, to live only to do the will of God. And Nehemiah courageously surrenders his comfort, taking a bold step of faith, knowing that he had been placed in his particular role for such a time as this. And the scripture tells us that Nehemiah prayed and sought the Lord even as he prepared and planned for 4 months before he made his bold request to his boss, the king, for permission and resources to return to Jerusalem and help rebuild the walls that had been broken down and the gates that had been burned with fire. And God, in his sovereign goodness and care, ministers even through this pagan world ruler and grants Nehemiah favor. And so he returns to Jerusalem. But what's amazing is how Nehemiah not only asks good questions in preparation, but he takes the time to make strategic observations, to see for himself the state of the once great city of Jerusalem. And Nehemiah does this by walking around the perimeter, making note of which areas were completely broken down, which areas were burned by fire, and which areas needed fortifications. Friends, think about your own sphere of influence. When was the last time you walked around the walls asking probing questions to uncover those areas that need shored up. Now, you might be thinking, well, for Nehemiah, it was very concrete. No pun intended. You might think it's easy to inspect a physical, tangible wall and to see directly which areas need restoration. However, you might ask, my life is so much more complex, abstract, complicated. My leadership context is very volatile, constantly changing, messy, and so intangible. Friends, this is where I'd like to suggest 4 diagnostic questions that every person and every leader can ask in order to evaluate and assess what is going well and what's not going so well, whether it's for your family, your workplace, your institution, or wherever you're serving. These questions help us consider the areas that are holding strong, that need shoring up, or need a complete rebuild. These questions I first learned from a dear colleague at the seminary, and over the years have studied variations of them in my readings. I've been using these questions over the last decade to help evaluate everything from my personal relationships to organizational challenges, to even problem solving in the face of crises. And I believe these questions can revolutionize your personal and organizational resilience. Are you ready? Here are the questions. Number 1, what's working? Number 2, what's broken? Number 3, what's confusing? And number 4, what's missing? Let's unpack these further. What is working? First, when finding our way through crisis, we must ask, what's working? As Rundle and Flanagan in their work Building Conflict-Competent Teams assert, what is it we should continue doing because it's working so well? I also love Heath and Heath's book, Switch, where they talk about leading change, and they argue for leaders to highlight the bright spots. These are areas of strength, areas of excellence, areas of success. These areas tend to have a significant positive impact. Every relationship or team or organization or family has something they're doing well, something they're doing right. They have something that is working at the highest level. And the key is that as a leader, you highlight these areas that are working well. You celebrate wins. You celebrate with your key team players, stakeholders, family members, all those who've helped the organization or the ministry excel. When we consider what's working well, we learn about the very practices and processes we need to keep doing, to not let up on, but to keep empowering each other to stay the course, to consistently doing these things that are effective in helping the organization stay resilient and on mission. When we determine what's working, what to continue doing, we determine the areas we need to keep at it, to keep doing these things repeatedly and consistently. However, we also need to consider not only what's working, but what is broken and what needs improvement. Where are the growth opportunities? Where are there broken down walls or gaps or bottlenecks? In discussions with many pastors over the years, it seems that most churches experience seasons of decline. And those churches that find renewal often begin with an honest assessment of the church's weaknesses, not just organizational, but also spiritual. I think of one church that lost 40% of its leaders overnight. It's a long story for another time. But this led the church in the short term to go into a crisis mode. But it also ended up resulting in renewal, where the church became less inwardly focused and more externally focused. So we have to take an honest look at the reality of our situation and ask questions like, what is something we need to stop doing and change because the team just isn't able to make it work? Are their systems out of alignment? Have leaders dropped the ball on communication? Is the pacing of organizational change between executive leaders and core stakeholders out of sync? What feedback loops have we established to gather not just information on areas of excellence, but equally on areas that need urgent improvement? Well, leaders should not be obsessive about what is broken. They should take an honest look to meaningfully reflect on what's not working well and how it can either be eliminated, changed, or refined. What is interesting is that this is where most people and their inner circle stop. These persons reflect on their personal and organizational strengths and weaknesses, but they may stop there. However, there are a couple more important questions to ask in order to take their family, team, or organization to the next level. So we ask, what's working? What is broken? Third, what is confusing? Think about your situation and the relational dynamics involved personally. Think about your ministry or organization and the current policies, procedures, processes. When was the last time you considered specific elements that are most confusing about them? Is what is written on the wall the same as what's spoken down the hall in terms of policies and procedures? What's confusing about the systems you're developing and working with? Finding clarity is key here. Reworking things until they are crystal clear is so important. Many organizations, for example, lack clarity and as a result flounder. Both personal and organizational clarity fuel resilience. I can't help but think of Elon Musk's well-known engineering and product design advice. He says, quote, "The best part is no part. The best process is no process. It weighs nothing, costs nothing, and can't go wrong." Musk emphasized eliminating unnecessary components rather than optimizing them. This approach is most evident in the Raptor engines that they use for their space rockets, and designers kept eliminating parts, improving overall rocket performance with each iteration. So we have to consider these areas. Is our mission clear? Does the team share the same understanding of the mission? What are our core values? Are these shared across the whole family, ministry, or organization? Is the pressing problem, those broken down areas, are they clearly understood and defined? Do I understand what my role is in the problem? Do I understand the role of those around me? With clarity, teams can function with a greater capacity. And this is especially true when these roles are clearly defined and boundaries are clearly noted in terms of role and function. In other words, we have to clearly articulate who does what, by when, with whom, and how. And bringing these elements together, each team player must know their why and the why of the organization. They must know the why of their particular team and the why for addressing the problem and the compounding lack of clarity that may be at hand. Resilient persons and organizations regularly ask these kinds of questions. What's working? What's broken? What's confusing? And fourth and finally, and vitally important, what's missing? Here we explore what might be needed for us to start doing. For example, there may be something we need to start doing in the services we provide or the events that we offer or the systems that we're developing. From our meeting agendas to our budgets to our communication strategies, there may be gaps where we need to begin filling. I think of the educational leader who had a clear policy and procedure for years, but when the key implementers retired, the new hires weren't informed or trained in that particular policy, creating a huge gap. And for the longest time, leaders were baffled by what was missing. Sometimes the changes we need to implement to address what is missing begin as a pilot test, beginning on a small scale and then expanding further over a longer timeline. Other areas may need the missing piece added with greater urgency and implemented in a shorter period of time. Consider one thing that could significantly enhance effectiveness tomorrow if it were added today. It could be a missing mindset, a needed staff member, a budget item, a new process, an updated policy, a tighter feedback loop, an additional board member, a critical resource, or a fresh perspective. Friends, resilience is found in asking these 4 questions. What is working? What is broken? What is confusing? And what is missing? Sometimes we focus too much on what's broken, leading to a spirit of negativity and discouragement. Other times we focus on what's working. While celebrating wins is important, we must be future-oriented as we move toward our destination. For Nehemiah, it was rebuilding the walls. For us, it's celebrating our accomplishments, addressing weaknesses, clarifying confusion, and adding what is missing. And all of this helps us to be resilient and to reach the mission that God has given us in a whole new level.